You're listening to Worksights, insights about the American workplace, workplace law, and the future of work. This podcast is produced by the Noble Law, an employment law firm with offices across the United States, and is hosted by managing partner Laura Noble, a recognized leader in employment law with over 20 years of diverse legal experience. This podcast is not intended to be used as legal advice and does not establish an attorney-client relationship with its listeners.
Today we're discussing transgender issues through the scope of employment rights with Dr. Jami Taylor. Dr. Taylor is currently a professor of political science and public administration and MPA director at the University of Toledo. She teaches a wide variety of courses in the areas of public policy, public administration, and American politics. She is a graduate of North Carolina State University, University of North Carolina, Greensboro, and Old Dominion University. Much of her research has been around LGBT rights related to policymaking, and she is best known for her published work on the politics of transgender rights. So, Dr. Taylor, welcome, and thank you for joining us.
Hi, thanks for having me. You can call me Jami. I don't really need to stand on some sort of decorum around my title. It's all good.
Well, I appreciate that because given the amount of education you've had, you certainly are well within your rights to have the moniker. But before we get in there, I just want to set the stage a little bit about what's going on in the workplace with respect to transgender equality. According to the National Center for Transgender Equality, 90% of transgender people were harassed or mistreated at work for being transgender, or they've had to hide who they were to avoid such treatment. More than 1 in 4 transgender people have lost a job due to bias. Forms of discrimination and harassment include things like refusing to hire a transgender person, violating privacy rights, harassment, and even physical and sexual violence on the job. One of the things that I want to discuss with Dr. Taylor today is the landmark Supreme Court case, Bostock versus Clayton County, often referred to simply as the Bostock case. The reason this case is so important is that in June 2020, for the first time, the Supreme Court clarified that federal law prohibits anti-transgender discrimination in employment. What are we looking at? We're looking at Title VII of the Civil Rights Act, which is the preeminent employment discrimination law in the U.S. And that law says that you can't discriminate against someone because of the employee's race, color, religion, sex, or national origin. And the question became in courts around the country was whether that language, because of sex, included discrimination on the basis of sexual orientation or gender identity. And while from a plaintiff's employment perspective, my answer would have been, of course it does. I think my opinion was in the minority among the federal courts that were addressing this issue. So it worked its way through our federal courts and landed in the Supreme Court. And Justice Gorsuch wrote the majority opinion stating the answer is clear. An employer who fires an individual for being homosexual or transgender fires that person for traits or actions it would have not have questioned in members of a different sex. Sex plays a necessary and undisguisable role in the decision, exactly what Title VII forbids. So as of June 2020, we now have protections in the workplace for the LGBT community, which was a landmark decision, long in coming and quite celebrated amongst many, many folks who value anti-discrimination, anti-harassment in the workplace. Having said that, Title VII, as the only form of protection against discrimination in the workplace for LGBT folks, is not sufficient. And we will go through why that is the case. 23 states have recognized that by passing their own laws protecting individuals from workplace discrimination based on their gender identity. But many states, including the one I live in, North Carolina, have no explicit prohibition for discrimination based on sexual orientation or gender identity, which means that under certain circumstances, employers can still discriminate or harass folks on this basis without recourse, without any consequences to their behavior. That's sort of the overall landscape of where we are on this issue in terms of the kinds of discrimination that take place and what the law is currently on the federal level and in some states. So tell me a little bit about how you became an expert in this field, your personal and professional journey that brought you here.
Yeah, I started looking at this issue when I was a graduate student at NC State, and I came to it out of personal interest because I'm also a trans woman, and at the time in the early 2000s there was very few legal protections for trans individuals, and it's been very interesting to see how this very small minority group that is very frankly disliked in American politics has achieved the number of legal protections they have over the past, say, 20 years. I mean, it really is fascinating.
It really is. I mean, we were talking earlier about the Bostock decision, and that many of us in the advocacy world didn't think it had a chance in hell, didn't think that this was going to be the way that it was going to, unfold. And yet we got Justice Gorsuch, of all people, to write this opinion that says, yeah, just look at the statute. It's in the, it's right there in black and white. It's in the law. So, obviously you can't do this. We're like, well, why did it take us 20 years to get here? But okay, thank you, Justice.
Yeah. Well, I mean, it was one of those things that had been percolating in the federal court since the 70s. And, the early cases basically did not find trans protections under Title VII. And then after the Price Waterhouse decision in 1989, around sex stereotyping, these things would eventually be applied to trans people in the early 2000s. And this would also provide some of the basis for some of the subsequent changes that the Obama administration made through executive branch action, many of which were reversed by the Trump administration. But then Bostock happened, and then the Biden administration has used the Bostock decision to basically reinstate things on much firmer legal ground. But, the Bostock decision really only did apply to an employment context and not other things like Title IX or healthcare access, or those sorts of things.
And housing still remains an issue, right? That's not been addressed in the law. Tell our audience more about sex stereotyping as it applies in the legal context, and particularly the Price Waterhouse decision.
Yeah, I mean, Price Waterhouse was a decision that did not involve trans individual. It was a case where a female employee of the big accounting firm, was basically she was aggressive, sort of hard charging, and these were traits that were celebrated if it was done by a guy, and she was denied partner because she had those traits. They sort of viewed her as unladylike, and the courts, frowned upon that in 89, and this would later get applied to trans people because a trans person is, has a degree of gender dysphoria. They may not, act according to the stereotypes of their birth sex. And so it was easy to apply this. Now, some district and appellate courts did not, take that view even after Price Waterhouse. But, several did, including the 6 where, my employer is University of Toledo. Right.
And so that was the tool, though, in a way that got it to the Supreme Court, because we had different opinions at the lower court levels. And I know that the EEOC had long taken the position that employers couldn't discriminate against people on the basis of their gender identity or sexual orientation because of this sex stereotyping theory. I think that the lower court's disagreement over the application of the sex stereotyping legal theory of protection under Title VII is what propelled it to the Supreme Court and set it up in a way so that we could ultimately have the court make a decision about what does Title VII really mean, what does because of sex mean, how does that apply with respect to discrimination against people on the basis of their gender identity or sexual orientation.
Yeah, the split in the circuit certainly helped there. The EEOC during the Obama administration did take that view based on that litigation, but that was an Obama administration era change. So I mean, it wasn't very long standing. So
right, but as you point out, when it's just an EEOC based opinion, for lack of a better word, that's a federal agency that's applying Title VII to its enforcement responsibilities. But then there's the question of whether or not that agency decision is binding upon the court, and that goes to that whole other constitutional argument, which I'm not going to have with you right now. But it was not secure enough for people in the advocacy world to just say, okay, that's fine. The EEOC agrees with us. We're done. So I think, and maybe you have some insight onto what was happening behind the scenes that really brought this to the forefront of public consciousness.
Well, trying to get the EEOC to make that call had been a strategy that activists had been pursuing. Matter of fact, at the start of, when President Obama was elected, LGBT rights groups set up basically a blueprint for change for things that could be done through the executive branch. And this is in many aspects of LGBT rights. And many of these did happen. And on the trans front, most of them happened in the second term. There were some in the first term, but in terms of LGBT rights, the first term was very much dominated by same-sex marriage.
Right. And then talk to me a little bit about what happened during the Trump administration before the Bostock decision.
Well, as you noted, executive branch action is not very secure. And so when you had a change in administrations, it was reversed. And this is not uncommon. We see this at governor level repeatedly on LGBT rights. And so the Trump administration took a very different view about inclusion. They took a very narrow reading of the statute, unlike the view that many LGBT rights activists have and the Obama administration had taken. And they rolled back a lot of protection and interpretation of those statutes. And basically any statute or executive branch policy where the term sex had been used to apply to gay or trans people.
So let me back up for a second, because I want to make sure that we are all on the same page with respect to some of the terms that we're using here. So I'm going to rely on your expertise to educate us all on the difference between, just transgender as the broad term that we're using, and then transgender versus gender non-conforming versus non-binary. Can you help us unpack those?
This is an area where it's constantly changing, and so I will do my best. The term transgender refers to people with some degree of gender dysphoria with their sex at birth, right? And it transgender people have this a gender identity that differs from their birth sex. Okay. Now, in the case of non-binary people, they want to get away from this notion of a gender binary that there are two sexes. And this is a relatively new way of thinking. And there's actually some divide, right, in this broader trans community, right? There are people like me who transitioned genders like many years ago. And then there are the more recent non-binary, which they make a transition, but maybe not to male or female, right? And so they can all be under this umbrella.
And that makes sense to me, and that's a helpful clarification. Explain to our listeners the difference between sexual orientation and gender identity, because we're using those both in terms of describing the expansive now reading of Title VII, protecting both sexual orientation and gender identity. So for those who may not sure where the line goes there, can you help us understand that?
Yeah, sexual orientation basically refers to who you love or who you're attracted to, I guess is a better way to say that. And gender identity is really about who you are and how you view yourself in terms of your gender. Right. And of course, most people have some degree of sexual orientation, including trans people, right? And it can get very, very confusing for a lot of people when we talk about sexual orientation of a trans person.
Right, yeah. Exactly. Well, from an employment perspective, my response would be, why do you need to? So let's talk about the kinds of discrimination that happens in the workplace. Do you have any experience with that personally, or?
Yes. I transitioned, over 20 years ago. Yes, I have a whole litany of horror stories. At one public employer in the state of North Carolina, I was asked how somebody with my identity would be able to operate in a room full of conservative Christians on a job interview.
Mm-hmm.
I was told at a public employer in North Carolina that my identity was too far out for their educational institution.
Meaning that they wouldn't hire you or didn't want you to work with them?
Yes, I was told by a dean. Yeah, I've just had a whole litany of stuff like that in terms of trying to get a job. On the job, I've been called it. I've been misgendered.
Explain to my audience what that means to be misgendered.
Yeah, my identity is female, as is my legal sex, and I have some students and occasional faculty or staff members that will refer to me as he. So yeah, I mean those sorts of things do happen. I have gotten some harassment on the job. It's just a question of how far you're going to pursue it, and has something actually happened to you other than maybe your feelings gotten hurt?
Right. Well, from an employment rights advocate's perspective, none of this should be happening. You shouldn't have to put up with this in the workplace. It's against the law, but it's also counterproductive to everything that an employer wants, which is engaged, smart, dynamic, well-educated, accomplished employees like yourself, being in an environment which will only grow and encourage your accomplishments. And I will say that we have seen some change in private companies and their practices because they're recognizing this, right? Mm-hmm. So 57% of Fortune 500 companies now have policies that include prohibitions against gender identity expression or sexual orientation discrimination. And they're not doing it because they want everyone to hold hands and sing Kumbaya, right? They're motivated by the bottom line, and they recognize that having an inclusive workplace is better for them, their company, their profits. Which goes to our question about how can employers make their workplace safe for trans employees?
Well, I mean, one of the things that it really does start at the top. You need to set the tone for inclusion. Your corporate policies need to reflect those values. You need to have gender identity, sexual orientation, inclusion in your non-discrimination policy explicitly. You need to make sure that you don't have policies that are just blatantly discriminatory against the LGBT community. You need to also really follow the very rapid changes in the law in this area. I mean, the Bostock decision is only a little over a year old.
Right.
That's a huge change. We're going to see the expansion of employment protections for trans people also run up against religious freedom claims.
That's so interesting. Tell me more about that.
Yeah, well, the political right has sometimes attacked LGBT rights on a religious basis, right? Yeah, religious freedom basis, protected under the First Amendment. And we don't yet fully understand how this court is going to view this conflict that can exist sometimes between religious freedom and civil rights protection.
Exactly.
And so this is going to evolve, and employers are going to have to follow this very closely, because it's pretty clear that the Bostock decision was very narrow. It just did look at employment. It didn't say anything about restrooms or public accommodation or religious freedom protection or anything else.
Housing, for instance, right?
Yeah. When we're talking about non-discrimination, we commonly see this fight between certain piecemeal protections, like just around employment, or versus what's known as comprehensive non-discrimination protection, where we're looking at public accommodations, housing, employment, education, credit. I mean, right. There's a whole list of areas there.
Medical insurance.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
Or, even state funded, federal funded medical, Medicaid, Medicare. Right. What's I don't know the state of the law there, but I'm guessing that it's not completely clear yet.
Yeah. It is an evolving area, and the current administration is taking the view that because of the Bostock decision, all of these other things are going to be inclusive. And as we were talking earlier, this could change with a future administration. And it's probably going to be the courts that are going to end up settling this, because there's very little prospect in the current Congress, or what is likely to happen after 2022, of anything passing in terms of federal legislation to deal with these issues.
So you had pointed out to me, there is a proposed law right now in Congress that's probably dead on arrival, but that would provide for that kind of comprehensive protections for trans folks, as well as issues of sexual orientation, right? So tell me more about what you know about that legislation and what chances it has of success.
Yeah, LGBT activists have been fighting to get inclusion under federal non-discrimination statutes for over a generation at this point. And they have not been successful. Initially, we decided to go for something called the Employment Non-Discrimination Act, and there was a big fight over whether or not we were going to include transgender people in that. That occurred primarily in the 2000s. Eventually, advocates decided to pursue transgender inclusion after a big fight within the LGBT advocacy community, which really divided over this issue. Subsequently, advocates have pushed for more comprehensive legislation known as the Equality Act. And, it is kind of dead on arrival, even with Democrats controlling Congress, because of the institutional rules in the Senate around filibuster. So
right.
It's going nowhere.
The other thing, though, about Title VII that I want to talk to you about is, for people who are not as familiar with this law, it only applies to companies that have 15 or more employees. And you have to exhaust what's called administrative remedies before you even get to court on your claims. So you have to go through the EEOC, the Equal Employment Opportunities Commission, file your charge, have them do an investigation, discharge their investigation with the right to sue, and then you get the privilege of going to federal court. Versus if you were, litigating over the validity of your patent, you go straight to federal court. You don't have to wait 6 months. Under this law, additionally, individual claims are capped for damages, caps that were set 45 years ago, by the way, monetarily, and have not been adjusted. And my final rant on this is that federal court is not an easy place to get to for most individuals. There are very few federal courts in each state. It's more expensive to file a claim there. It's harder to find an attorney who's licensed to practice in federal court. So all of these barriers are in place under federal law for someone to seek justice when they have been wrongly terminated on the basis of their sexual orientation or gender identity, which is just bull that these individual rights have so many barriers in place, unlike individual business rights or individual contract rights or individual, negligence rights. So what has happened at the state level is many states have recognized and said, okay, well, we as a state are going to take a position that no one is allowed to discriminate against people on the basis of their gender orientation or sexual identity, regardless of whether you have 15 employees or not. And so we're going to put our own state laws in place so then individuals can rely on those state laws to get into courts more quickly and protect their rights.
Yeah, it's in some states have decided to do that, and as have some localities. But again, there's a question of how strong are those protections? How easy it is to get to a remedy, and there is variation. Yeah,
right.
I think North Carolina is now seeing some localities passing non-discrimination ordinances that protect gay and transgender people. But what sort of enforcement mechanisms do they have? I haven't looked at the statutes, but I'm guessing there's very little in terms of enforcement mechanism.
So it's interesting, Jami, that you talk about the local cities creating their own ordinances to try to put these protections in place that the state's unwilling to do. Worse still, North Carolina, unconvinced that it got beat up badly enough with the bathroom bill, then lashed out against these municipalities with this state law that said you as a local municipality can't have broader protections than what the state provides. So trying to, stomp down on even the localities that are saying, look, within our city, most people want these protections. And if you state aren't willing to do it, we're going to put it into place. And they're like, no. We definitely want to keep discriminating against people. Don't do that, cities. We're not on board with that.
Well, preemption is a common tool that state legislatures use to deal with recalcitrant localities. And local policy making in this area is not uncommon in states where localities have a degree of home rule. And what you can do under home rule is really defined by state statute and local charters, that are granted by the state. And so this is it's not uncommon to see these local policies where localities have the freedom to do it. That being said, some states have taken preemption. North Carolina attempted to do so, but there was question whether or not localities could enact these sort of protections prior to HB2. And even in some pretty progressive municipalities, you hadn't seen it because of the legal questions about whether or not they had the legal authority to do so. One of the interesting things about HB2 is you actually end up getting an advancement of LGBT rights because of the uproar. I don't know if you remember what happened was former Governor McCrory enacted an executive order that just covered state government that gave LGBT people some protection. And of course, this is something that Equality North Carolina had been trying to get forever. Now, it wasn't a very strong order, and it was subsequently improved upon by Governor Cooper. But, when the legislature, in repealing that, put the moratorium on, they basically say, yeah, after the moratorium, you're going to have some freedom to do this. And we've seen this happen in localities in North Carolina. It's like one of the interesting things about the way HB2 played out in the state is it ended up advancing LGBT rights in the state. Right.
And remind folks again what HB2 was here in North Carolina.
That was the bathroom bill is what it got labeled. The legislature and conservative government, time Governor McCrory, passed this legislation that did roll back, Charlotte's decision to have an inclusive non-discrimination ordinance, and they did a lot of other things in the legislation, but it became known as the bathroom bill because it restricted the ability of some trans people to use restrooms that align with their gender identity. Now, you can't say all because some trans people were not covered by the statute because they had undergone a legal change of sex under North Carolina law.
Which it always boggled my mind how they thought that was going to be enforced anyway, that they were going to have public health officials at every bathroom to check your status. It made no sense.
I mean, this is an area that's called morality politics, right? And it's commonly morality politics issues are commonly used as wedge issues for more political purposes, and that was HB2 was a political tool that didn't really work as expected.
Right. Well, I got involved in HB2 because they buried deep down in the bill a provision that would eliminate wrongful termination in violation of public policy rights in North Carolina. So again, North Carolina doesn't have its own actionable anti-discrimination statute. It has a public policy in place that says employers can't discriminate against employees on the basis of sex, race, national origin, disability, but there's no enforcement mechanism to it. So the courts over the years have said, if you violate this provision, that's a violation of public policy. And so employees have a right to sue under common law principles of governance. And they were attempting to pull that out of the toolbox that basically employees would have in order to enforce their anti-discrimination rights. Very sneaky. evil genius kind of stuff, but ultimately we're able to save that and preserve that. So even though we have relatively weak tea with respect to anti-discrimination laws in North Carolina, we still have that thanks to the downfall of the bathroom bill. So
it was an interesting bill, and there had been some some other employer friendly policies that were part of that. It wasn't just about the bathroom issue.
But they definitely used that moral wedge issue to get people excited about the bill, the conservatives who wanted it, and then buried all of these other things in there that were bad for employees and bad for workers.
Yeah. I mean, and that's fair in politics. I mean, I may disagree with it, but that's part of politics, is to find a wedge issue and use it to win elections. That's the way the game's played.
Tell me, have you done any research on the arguments that are made in support of those bills? Things like, we don't want violence to occur in bathrooms from people who are not the identity of the sex of the bathroom that they're supposed to be in.
Oh yeah, no, in my research, I look at both the adoption of policy and public opinion on these issues. And one of the things that my research, with my colleagues has found is, that public attitudes do vary by issue. And things that look more like traditional civil rights concerns, or like employment, tend to have greater levels of support than things that deal with transgender bodies.
Okay.
And bathrooms would fall under that bodies issue. Bodies, sport, medical care access, and so those types of issues have lower levels of support. Their use as wedge issues.
Right.
And in these types of battles, it is common to use what's known as a security frame to basically paint trans people as threatening. And this, we definitely see that around the bathroom issue. It is common framing in ads.
And my understanding, correct me if I'm wrong, is there is no empirical evidence that trans people committed crimes in bathrooms. And in fact, they are far more likely to be the victims of violence in any public place rather than the perpetrator.
Yeah, I mean, that is not an issue.
So for you in the advocacy community, I'm assuming that you are in the advocacy community, or would you describe yourself as that?
Well, okay. That's actually a complicated question. In my professional capacity, I am absolutely not an advocate. Absolutely not. There's a real divide in the scholars who study these issues. There are some people that are known as scholar activists, and they do take a normative approach to these. I am not a scholar activist.
Okay, what's the difference?
I basically call it like I see it in terms of what I find. I'm not trying to shape public policy with it. I mean, my research has actually been quoted by opponents of transgender rights.
Interesting.
I am trying to be as neutral as possible in terms of what I find in my research. And I don't try to put a thumb on the scale of it. When we do public opinion polls, we are not using some sort of skewed sample to make a point. We're using nationally representative samples. When I am looking at the adoption of state policy, I am using very standard measures of, say, ideology of state lawmakers, or the ways that we measure the influence of interest groups, or those sorts of things. I'm not here to, in a professional capacity, to change public policy to advance transgender rights. That is not the way I do my career.
Okay.
That being said, I have been on the board of Equality North Carolina. I've been on the board of Equality Toledo in a personal capacity. And yeah, I do largely favor most aspects of LGBT rights. But even with me, I don't co-sign on everything that the movement favors. I I haven't been as enthused about some of the move towards non-binary, and that's just my own personal thing. You know, I think things like pregnant people that we hear this term are a little weird, and you know, there are other people than trans individuals that have an identity, and that includes women or
Right.
mothers, right? So I mean, it's a complicated thing.
It is a complicated issue. So if you had the opportunity to, stand on a mountaintop and shout out the most interesting, compelling, or unknown things about your research to folks, what would it be?
Give me a second on that. I didn't see that one coming.
We can come back to it. You've just done such
okay.
incredible work, and you've got 2 different books out, and there's so much there that I want to give you an opportunity to say, look, this is, on these decades that I've done this kind of work, this is what people still are failing to understand.
Yeah, well, I guess one of the things I'm interested in now is because of the rise of non-binary identities. I want us to understand how the public feels about that, and public attitudes on non-binary identities. I mean, we in public opinion research, we commonly use what are known as feeling thermometers to gauge people's attitudes towards various groups in society. And one of the things we know is that transgender people are less favored than gays and lesbians by a substantial margin.
Right.
At one point, when we first started doing some of this public opinion research around 2015, they were down around atheists. It basically is one of the most unpopular groups in American society. We believe, based on more recent research that we've done, that's getting ready to come out in Public Opinion Quarterly, that we've seen some improving attitudes on some things, right? But how does this relate with non-binary identities? And because you usually, when we think transgender people, you're thinking either trans man, trans woman, right? As somebody who's transitioned from one sex to the opposite sex. But how does non-binary figure into this, and how do people react to that? Do they just like sit there and like, I don't know? Or do they realize about this? Are there questions? I mean, anecdotally, I've heard, at least in legislative context, that some advocates on the record have said that this has been unhelpful.
What has been unhelpful?
That the rise of talking about non-binary identities has been unhelpful in talking to what are usually older legislators, that they just the eyes glaze over. And
right. I'm thinking particularly the use of the pronouns they, them, which my parents, who are lifelong, Democrats, absolutely cannot wrap their heads around. They cannot use those pronouns if their life depended on it. No matter how many times their grandchildren try to educate them, they cannot do it.
Look, I mean, I'm a trans woman, been out for decades at this point, and I have a friend of mine who's non-binary, and I do my best to discuss their identity and use the correct pronouns, and I struggle,
right,
in sentences sometimes, and I really have to make a conscious effort to get it right, and sometimes I fumble, and it is hard. I mean, just like sometimes the stuff around pronouns, around our standard view of trans people is hard. It's
people, I appreciate that. Yeah. And I appreciate that because as a small business owner myself, I do have empathy for employers who are trying to put in policies and practices to be inclusive. And I recognize that it is a process. We're not going to show up perfectly every time. We need to have some grace and understanding and compassion for all of us, those of us who have been marginalized and those of us who are trying to improve their education and understanding. And so often you see just, people suiting up in their regular jerseys and battling it out without a whole lot of attempts at compassion and understanding on either side.
Right, and this is a real issue. I mean, I think a general rule is treat people like you want to be treated, and that includes when you make a mistake, an honest mistake, and it happens. I do it. It's happened to me many times, and you do need to have, I think, the ability to forgive.
Right.
I mean, that is an important thing. But you go back to having some of the, trying to improve your policies within organizations. Sometimes because of the diversity in say the trans community or the broader LGBTQ community, that policies that get enacted may actually anger some aspects of that community. We see this right now with the preferred pronouns thing, and I feel that personally.
Tell me, in what way would that anger members of the LGBT community?
Well, and here I'm just going to talk about my personal experience with preferred pronouns. I think it's fine that we have preferred pronouns for people who want to use them. But I transitioned many decades ago at this point, so I didn't have to tell people my preferred pronoun, right? And when we require people to say a preferred pronoun, you're not respecting my identity as a trans woman. And this is coming from some of our own activists. And this has happened to me multiple times in professional contexts. I mean, I work in academia, in the social sciences, where let's stereotype where social sciences are on a lot of this stuff. And it's happened multiple times where people have tried to force me to declare my pronouns, and I just refuse, because it's self-evident what my preferred pronouns are.
I had never thought about that before, that for the non-binary community, they want to decouple appearance from pronouns, right? They don't want anyone looking at them and saying, you must identify as male, you must identify as female. But for someone who transitioned, that was the goal. You want to be identified as female. You want someone to look at you and say female.
Give people space to declare. I think it's great that people want to be themselves, whatever that is. Give them space to do that.
I'm really fascinated by this intersection between the transgender experience and gender inequality in the workplace. And what I'm talking about is some work that's been done by sociologist Kristen Schilt and others about looking at unequal treatment at work among genders, typically discrimination against people who identify as female. And that there have been a lot of discussions that this disparity is biological differences in the sex, or it's family concerns for women, right? The whole 80 cents on every dollar. People try to explain that way. Well, women are making different choices with respect to their career. And what Ms. Schilt did was do interviews and observational data with trans men. So, and it revealed the way that their experience in the workplace got better after they transitioned from female to male, and vice versa, got worse after they transitioned from male to female. And I just find that absolutely fascinating, that it just, kind of lays bare these forms of gender inequality. And I'm just wondering if you had any experience like that.
Well, I guess for me, I switched careers at the same time I transitioned. I went from working government to academia. And so it is a little bit different contextually.
Right.
I would say that I do pick up some of these subtle gender bias things, but maybe not to some of the degree that some of my cisgender female colleagues get.
Right.
but I get a very different type of discrimination based around trans identity on top of that. I don't get, some of my cisgender female colleagues, complain about some of the treatment they get around gender, and I get different experiences. But one, at my university, literally everyone there knows I'm a trans woman,
right?
And so I get treated differently on probably a lot of things, and I'm hardly a shrinking violet either,
right?
And so I just get different treatment,
right?
And so, but it's hard to compare. I would say it's not great treatment. I'll be honest with you. And my employer has been overall pretty good.
Right. Well, you had mentioned before, using the incorrect pronouns, or, in and of itself, doing that repeatedly is a form of harassment. There's, like you said, yes, we have grace and forgiveness, and when people fumble, but when people are doing it persistently and purposefully, that's a different ballgame.
Yeah, well, like even around, I guess some institutional policies hurt me.
Like what?
I need to have a doctor who is competent with treating trans people. Not because, I need any particular medical intervention. Those happened long ago. But I do need somebody who is can understand that, yeah, I am a trans person, and not deny treatment based on that. Well,
right.
We have a problem with our insurance policy that restricts us to certain providers, none of which are the people I need to see. So I actually have to live an hour away from where I work, and the people who provide care for that we're sort of pushed towards under our insurance policy have gotten better. I'm not ready to give up access to my inclusive doctor yet.
Nor should you have to.
Right. And so those sort of things are real. And it's an institutional level policy.
Right. That could easily change. There's really I can't imagine the justification for that, other than this is the way we've always done it, and we're not going to change it.
Oh, it was really about what the current new insurance provider wanted, right? They're also a medical they have an insurance arm and a medical arm.
Right.
It's not shocking that they favor their product, and if I had an insurance company, I would as well. If I had a medical practice that was a part of the same company,
right.
I would favor my own product too. So I can't blame them for that, but this sort of thing wasn't on their radar.
Jami, I want to close by asking you, for the benefit of our listeners, most of whom are probably not transgender, what can they be doing as employees, and if they're employers in the workplace, to help foster a more inclusive environment for trans coworkers and employees?
Well, regardless of how you feel about transgender identities or the identities of anyone else, always try to treat people like you want to be treated. It's the best rule. Try to respect people's identities, even if you don't understand them or you disagree with them. And there are a lot of things in life that we agree with or disagree with that we decide to let go because it's not worth a fight, or it's not an issue, it's not relevant. Try to make trans identities one of those things. I don't understand left-handed people. Right? I fundamentally, my daughter's left-handed. I don't understand left-handers. My left hand is just there for looks, right? It's try to treat trans identity like left-handed people. It's just different. It just is. You don't have to get it.
But I tell my employers, when in my advice and counsel role all the time, just focus on the work. You focus on what are the work requirements, what are the deliverables that you want to see from this employee? Is this employee meeting those requirements? And then all that other stuff, that's not something anyone should be considering. race, gender, sexual orientation, identity, disability, age, none of that matters. What matters is the work. And if we can all focus on that, we can then, engage our workforce to be their most, productive selves. And that's really, I'm a big fan of business and capitalism. I'm unabashedly a fan. I think it helps lift people out of poverty, does good things for the world. I just want it to be a fair and safe workplace for everyone.
Yeah, I mean and that goes beyond just those particular enumerated classes. Everyone.
Right. Exactly. Well, Dr. Taylor, this has been a fascinating conversation. I could talk to you for hours on this. I can tell already. So I'm going to encourage people to go and look at your books, The Remarkable Rise of Transgender Rights and Transgender Rights in Politics, Groups, Issue Framing, and Policy Adoption. Well, thank you for providing me with some excellent information and education. I very much appreciate it, and I wish you continued success.
All right. Well, thanks for having me. Have a good one.
This has been Worksights. You can learn more about Laura Noble and the Noble Law on LinkedIn, Facebook, or thenoblelaw.com. Thank you for listening.